The Arizona sky burns hot over a land that had forgotten the taste of mercy, a vast and silent canvas of ochre dust and skeletal mesquite where every grain of sand carries the whisper of an old curse. Here, on the edge of desolation, stood the Vance Ranch, a place less like a home and more like a monument to a life that had ended too soon. Jacob Vance existed within its walls, a man carved from the same unforgiving stone as the surrounding mesas, his heart a locked room since the day he had buried his wife, Martha. The silence in his home was a physical presence, a heavy blanket that smothered the laughter of his two children, Samuel and Lily, who moved through the rooms like ghosts, their small faces etched with a premature solemnity. They watched their father, a former sheriff whose moral compass now spun aimlessly in a sea of grief, and learned that love was a thing to be remembered, not felt. It was a somber afternoon, the sun a merciless eye in the cloudless expanse, when the rhythmic thud of approaching hooves announced the arrival of a different kind of cruelty. Kane Thorne, a man whose shadow seemed to poison the ground it touched, rode into the yard, his smile a slash of predatory amusement. He was known in those parts as the Vulture, a creature who profited from the misfortunes of others, and he had come to mock the stillness of Jacob's sorrow. Behind him, tethered by a coarse rope, was a slight figure, a woman whose embroidered silk tunic was a slash of vibrant color against the muted browns of the west. Her head was bowed, her eyes were fixed on the rotten wooden planks beneath her feet as if that was the only thing solid in a shattered world. "A gift, Vance," Kane sneered, his voice scraping the air. "To warm your cold bed. They say these Chinese dolls are obedient." He shoved the woman forward, and she stumbled, catching herself with a quiet grace that seemed utterly out of place in the brutal exchange. Jacob's face was a mask of granite, his eyes betraying nothing of the storm that raged within him. He looked from the woman, so small and fragile, to the sneering face of the man who had turned human misery into a spectator sport. The children, peeking from behind a faded calico curtain, shrank back, their wide eyes reflecting a fear that was old and familiar. Kane was enjoying himself, savoring the humiliation he was inflicting, a public display of Jacob's lonely, broken state. The entire transaction was a cruel joke, a calculated jab at a man who had nothing left to lose, except the hollowed-out shell of his own dignity. Kane laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed in the oppressive heat, and dismounted, his boots kicking up clouds of dust as he swaggered toward the porch, leaving the woman standing alone in the yard, a silent testament to the casual cruelty of men. Kane Thorne leaned against the porch railing, his gaze lingering on the woman with a possessive, greasy appraisal that made the air feel thick and foul. He lit a cheroot, the smoke curling from his lips like a venomous serpent, and continued his performance for an audience of one silent, grief-stricken man. "I won her in a card game down in Tucson," he drawled, blowing a plume of smoke towards the sky. "The fella who lost her said she was good with her hands. If you take my meaning, his words were a physical blow, each one laced with a vile insinuation meant to further degrade both Jacob and the woman he now unofficially possessed." Jacob's hands clenched into fists at his sides, the knuckles turning white. A low growl was building in his chest, the long-dormant instinct of the lawman, the protector, stirring from its slumber. He was a breath away from shattering Kane's smug face, a breath away from violence that would solve nothing but would feel like a righteous storm. But before the tempest could break, a new sound cut through the tension, a voice as soft as the whisper of wind through canyon grass, yet as clear and unyielding as river stone. It was the woman. She had lifted her head, and for the first time, Jacob saw her eyes. They were not filled with fear or despair, but with a deep, ancient calm, a well of quiet strength that seemed to defy the very world she had been thrown into. She spoke first in her own tongue, a string of melodic, sharp syllables that sounded like a judgment. Then, her dark eye still fixed on Kane, she translated, her English precise and deliberate. "A man who builds his house on the suffering of others," she said, her voice never rising, yet it carried across the yard with the weight of a prophecy, "will find only snakes in his bed." The world seemed to stop. The wind held its breath. The children behind the curtain froze. Kane Thorne's sneering smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of genuine shock. He had expected tears, submission, or silence. He had not expected a curse delivered with the finality of a death sentence. Jacob's blood, which had been simmering with rage, ran hot with something else entirely, a jolt of stunned admiration. In that single, defiant statement, she had reclaimed her own humanity. She was not a doll, not a prize, not a victim. She was a person, with a voice and a will that Cain's cruelty could not extinguish. The moment stretched, taut and shimmering, before Cain broke it with a forced, ugly laugh. He tried to reclaim his power, calling her a spitfire and making another crude remark, but the damage was done. The joke had lost its punchline. He mounted his horse, threw one last hateful glare at Jacob, and rode away, his retreat more telling than any threat. Jacob was left in the ringing silence, the woman's word still hanging in the air, a promise and a warning. He looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time, and saw not a problem delivered to his doorstep, but a profound and unsettling mystery. That night under a pale moon, the Vance ranch was submerged in a new kind of silence. The old silence had been born of absence and loss, a hollow echo in an empty house. This new silence was one of presence, of an unknown quantity introduced into a delicate, broken equation. Jacob had shown the woman, whose name he did not yet know, to a small, sparse room at the back of the house, a storage space with a simple cot and a single, dust-streaked window. He had placed a bowl of water and a piece of bread on a crate beside the bed, a gesture that was more functional than kind, and then retreated back into the fortress of his own mind. He sat in his worn armchair, the fire casting long, dancing shadows on the walls, and listened. He heard the faint creak of the floorboards as she moved about her small room, the soft splash of water, the rustle of cloth. These were the sounds of a life quietly asserting itself in a place that had been given over to the memory of death. His heart, that locked room he had sealed so carefully, felt the faintest tremor against its door. The next morning, Jacob rose before the sun, the habit of a lifetime of work ingrained in his bones. He expected to find her gone, perhaps having slipped away into the vast, indifferent wilderness during the night. Instead, he found the main room of the house subtly changed. A grimy window had been washed, allowing the weak morning light to penetrate the gloom. A stack of his children's discarded books had been neatly arranged on a shelf. She was standing by the cold hearth, her hands clasped behind her back, her posture one of quiet observation. She did not speak, and neither did he. Words were a currency they did not yet share. The children, Samuel and Lily, emerged from their room and stopped short, seeing her there. They clung to the doorway, their small forms a portrait of apprehension and fascination. They watched as she turned and, without a word, began to methodically sweep the dusty floor with a worn broom, her movements economical and graceful. She was not asking for a place, she was creating one through her own quiet labor. Jacob watched her, his expression unreadable, and felt a disquieting mix of resentment and respect. She was an intrusion, a living reminder of Cain Thorne's mockery, yet her silent industry was a stark rebuke to the inertia of his own grief. He had let his home, his life, his family, fall into a state of suspended decay, and this stranger, this woman who had been brought to him in chains, was the first to begin the slow, arduous work of sweeping away the dust. The days that followed settled into a strange, unspoken rhythm, a slow dance of avoidance and observation. Jacob would leave at dawn to mend fences and tend to his meager herd, losing himself in the physical toil that was the only solace he could find. The woman, who he learned was named Mylin after his daughter Lily shyly asked, would fill the house with a quiet purpose that was both unnerving and, to his deep surprise, calming. She cooked their simple meals, transforming bland rations of beans and salted pork into something more with the addition of wild herbs she'd gathered from the scrubland. She washed their clothes with a fragrant, herbal soap she made herself, its clean scent slowly replacing the stale smell of sorrow that had clung to the house for so long. Then, she turned her attention to the land itself. Just beyond the kitchen door was a patch of earth surrounded by a crumbling stone wall, a place where Martha had once tried to grow roses before the unforgiving sun had scorched them to ruin. It was now a graveyard of dry thorns and cracked soil, a perfect visual metaphor for Jacob's own heart. Mylin began her work there. Every morning, she would go to the garden, and with her bare hands, she would pull at the thorny weeds and pry the stones from the compacted earth. At first, Jacob thought it was a fool's errand, a pointless battle against a land that had never offered anything but hardship. He would watch from a distance as she toiled under the oppressive heat, her small frame a testament to a resilience he could not comprehend. He expected her to give up, to be broken by the sheer futility of it. But she never did. Day after day, she cleared the plot, her hands becoming raw and blistered, yet her focus never wavered. The children, drawn by her unwavering dedication, began to follow her. Samuel would bring her a cup of water, his movements hesitant. Lily would point out a colorful lizard basking on a rock. They were like small, cautious satellites, slowly being pulled into the orbit of her quiet gravity. This patch of dead earth, this garden surrounded by dry thorns and death, was becoming her sanctuary. It was a place where she was not a gift or a prize, but a creator, a nurturer, coaxing life from a place that had long forgotten it. And Jacob, whether he wanted to admit it or not, found himself watching, waiting, and wondering if anything could ever truly grow there again. It was a somber afternoon, the wind howling through the cracks in the cabin walls, sounding like a lament for all the things the world had lost. Jacob returned from the range, weary to his bones, the dust and the grief a heavy cloak upon his shoulders. He shed his outer shirt, a garment as frayed and worn as his own spirit, and tossed it onto a chair before washing his face in the basin. The shirt was a relic of his past life, a uniform from his days as sheriff, the silver star long since removed, but the memory of its weight remained. It was torn at the elbow, a long, jagged rip from where it had snagged on a barbed wire fence weeks ago, and he had simply ignored it, just as he ignored most things that required mending. He ate his supper in the usual silence, the only sounds the scrape of cutlery on tin plates and the mournful cry of the wind. My Lin and the children ate quietly, their gazes lowered. Later, as he prepared to retire for the night, he reached for the discarded shirt, intending to use it as a rag. He stopped. He picked it up, his calloused fingers tracing a line of impossibly neat, tiny stitches that ran along the torn elbow. The rip was gone, replaced by a seam so perfectly executed it was nearly invisible. The thread she had used matched the faded blue of the fabric exactly. It was not a functional patch, it was an act of restoration, a quiet piece of artistry. He held the mended fabric in his hands, feeling the strength of the repair, the deliberate care woven into every stitch. This small, silent act of service pierced the thick armor he had built around himself more effectively than any spoken word could have. It was a gesture of profound, unassuming care in a life that had become devoid of it. He looked across the room to where My Lin was now showing Lily how to braid a strand of yarn. The firelight softened the lines of her face, illuminating an expression of deep concentration and patience. She had mended his shirt. She was tending his garden. She was gently coaxing his children back towards the light. She was mending the fabric of his broken world, one quiet stitch at a time. He walked over to her, the heavy thud of his boots on the wooden floor causing her to look up. He stood before her, the mended shirt still in his hand. The words felt foreign and heavy on his tongue, but he forced them out. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with disuse. My Lin simply nodded, a small, almost imperceptible acknowledgement, but her eyes held a flicker of understanding. It was more than enough. The first thread of connection, fine but strong, had been sewn between them. The seasons began their slow, relentless turn, and with them, the landscape of the Vance ranch started to shift. The garden, once a plot of sun-baked despair, was now showing faint signs of life. Tiny green shoots, nurtured by My Lin's patient hands, pushed their way through the soil, a fragile but defiant promise of what was to come. The change, however, was not confined to the garden. It was in the air, in the way Lily's laughter now occasionally rang through the house, in the way Samuel would bring My Lin a curious rock or a fallen feather for her inspection. But hope, in this harsh land, was a dangerous thing, for it often attracted the vultures. Cane Thorn returned on a day when the sky was the color of a fresh bruise, his presence heralded by a cloud of dust on the horizon. He rode into the yard not with the swaggering mockery of his first visit, but with a cold, calculating look in his eyes. He saw the changes, the clean windows, the neatly swept porch, the improbable green of the budding garden. Most of all, he saw My Lin, who was hanging laundry on a line, her movements calm and measured. His greedy eyes no longer saw a cruel joke, they saw an asset, a capable and valuable possession he had foolishly underestimated. He dismounted and approached Jacob, who stood on the porch, his body a rigid barrier between Cain and the house. "Vance," Cain began, skipping the pleasantries. "Heard you're having trouble with your water rights." The creek's running low. A man could get thirsty, lose his whole herd. The threat was veiled, but clear. Cain controlled the main water source upstream, and he was not above strangling a man's livelihood to get what he wanted. "What do you want, Thorn?" Jacob asked, his voice flat and hard. Cain's eyes flickered towards my Lynn. "I've come to collect my property," he said, a cruel smirk returning to his face. I was feeling generous that day, but my generosity has its limits. "She's worth more than I thought." He was talking about her as if she were a stray cow he had come to reclaim. From the corner of his eye, Jacob saw my Lynn still, her hands frozen on the laundry line. She was listening, her quiet observation turning into a sharp, watchful tension. The peaceful rhythm of their lives was shattered. The fragile hope that had begun to bloom in the garden was now threatened by the shadow of the man who saw the world only in terms of what he could own, what he could break, and what he could take. The conflict was no longer a matter of pride or humiliation, it was now a fight for the very soul of the fragile home they had begun to build. The children became the unbreachable bridge between two silent adults. Where Jacob's grief and my Lynn's reserve had created a chasm of unspoken things, Samuel and Lily built a path with their simple, innocent trust. They were no longer wary satellites orbiting a mysterious star, they were now firmly in her constellation, drawn to the quiet warmth she emanated. She taught them things their father, lost in his own desolate landscape, had forgotten how to share. She showed them how to read the clouds for signs of rain, how to find the sweet, edible core of a cactus, and how to listen to the language of the wind. She would sit with them in the burgeoning garden, her fingers deftly weaving reeds into the shape of birds and horses, while their small, clumsy hands tried to imitate her. For the first time in years, the house was filled not with the sound of sorrowful silence, but with the murmur of their questions and the soft melody of her patient answers. One evening, as the setting sun painted the sky in strokes of fire and rose, Jacob watched from the shadows of the porch as my Lynn sat with his children near the fire pit. She was telling them a story, her voice low and hypnotic. It was a tale from her homeland, about a clever weaver who outsmarted a greedy emperor, her words painting vivid pictures of jade palaces and silk lanterns in the dusty Arizona twilight. Lily was leaning against her side, her head resting on my Lynn's shoulder, her eyes wide with wonder. Samuel sat cross-legged, his chin in his hands, completely captivated. He saw a peace on his children's faces that he thought had been lost forever, a light in their eyes that he feared had been extinguished with their mother. This quiet, resilient woman, who had been thrust upon them as an instrument of cruelty, had become their healer. She was tending not only to the barren soil of the garden but to the wounded souls of his children. Witnessing this scene, Jacob felt a profound shift within himself. The walls around his locked heart did not crumble, but a window was thrown open, letting in a sliver of light. He saw that his own paralysis, his inability to move beyond the specter of his wife's death, had been starving his children of the very comfort and security they needed. My Lynn was giving them what he could not. She was teaching them that life, like the garden, could grow again after a long and bitter winter. Their trust in her became his guide, a silent invitation to step out of the shadows and join them in the tentative warmth of the fire. The next morning dawned heavy and grey, the air thick with an unspoken dread. The storm broke not from the sky, but from the horizon, as Cain Thorn returned, and this time he was not alone. He rode with 3 hired men, rough-looking figures whose faces were hard and empty. They were not here to negotiate. They were here to take. They found out in the yard, a clear and brutal show of force, their presence an immediate violation of the fragile peace that had settled over the ranch. Jacob had been expecting this. He had seen the look in Cain's eyes, the insatiable greed that could never be reasoned with. He stepped out onto the porch, his old service revolver strapped to his hip, its weight both a comfort and a terrible burden. He had not worn it in years, but the feel of it was as familiar as his own skin. The children, sensing the danger, had been ushered inside by my Lynn, who now stood just inside the doorway, a silent, watchful guardian. "This is your last chance, Vance," Cain shouted, his voice ringing with false confidence. "Give me the woman and sign over the deed to your water rights, and we'll ride out of here. Refuse, and we'll burn this whole place to the ground with you in it." The air crackled with tension. Jacob's gaze was steady, his face as impassive as ever, but inside, the dormant lawman, the protector, was wide awake and filled with a cold, righteous fury. This was not just about land or water anymore. It was about the innocent laughter of his children, the quiet dignity of a woman who had shown him how to live again, and the sacred ground of a home she had helped him rebuild from ashes. He looked past Cain, his eyes meeting My Lin's for a brief, fleeting second. In her gaze, he saw not fear, but a steady, unwavering faith. It was all the strength he needed. He drew his gun, the metallic click unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. "She is not yours to take," he said, his voice low and deadly serious, a promise of violence that left no room for doubt. "And this is my land," Cain sneered and gave the signal. The world exploded into chaos. Gunfire erupted, the sharp cracks echoing off the desolate hills. It was a sudden, intense climax, a brutal and swift clash of wills. Jacob moved with an economy of motion learned over years of facing down desperate men, his actions precise and deadly. He was no longer just a grief-stricken rancher, he was a father, a protector, fighting for every inch of the new life that had just begun to take root in the unforgiving soil of his world. The fight was over as quickly as it had begun, a whirlwind of smoke, shouting, and the stark finality of violence. When the dust settled, 2 of Cain's men were wounded on the ground and the 3rd had fled. Cain Thorne himself stood disarmed, a look of disbelief and fury on his face as he stared down the barrel of Jacob's revolver. The vulture had been grounded. There was no killing, only a grim and absolute defeat. Jacob's words were clipped, each one a shard of ice. "Get off my land. If I ever see you or your men near here again, I will not be so merciful." He watched, his gun never wavering, as Cain helped his injured men onto their horses and rode away, a broken and humiliated figure swallowed by the vast, indifferent landscape. The immediate aftermath was a deafening silence, broken only by the ragged sound of Jacob's own breathing. He looked down and saw a dark stain spreading across his left sleeve. A bullet had grazed his arm, a hot, searing pain he had barely registered in the heat of the conflict. He stumbled back towards the porch, the adrenaline fading, leaving behind a deep, bone-wearying exhaustion. My Lin was there in an instant. She helped him into a chair in the main room, her touch gentle but firm. The children peeked out from their room, their faces pale with fear, but she gave them a calm, reassuring look that sent them scurrying back to safety. Without a word, she retrieved a bowl of warm water and a clean cloth. From a small wooden box, she took out a bundle of dried leaves and a small jar of ointment, the scent of which was earthy and medicinal. These were herbs from her garden, plants she had nurtured from seed, now being used to heal the man who had defended that very ground. As she cleaned the wound, her movements were skillful and practiced, the knowledge of a traditional healer passed down through generations. The silence between them was no longer awkward or uncertain. It was a silence of profound, shared understanding, forged in the crucible of violence and survival. Her gentle hands tended to the physical wound, but her calm presence seemed to soothe a deeper injury within him. He watched her, her head bowed in concentration, the firelight catching the dark strands of her hair. He saw the immense strength that lay beneath her quiet exterior, the resilience of a willow that bends in the storm but does not break. When she was finished, she looked up, her dark eyes meeting his. He finally said the words that had been forming in his heart for weeks. "You have a home here, My Lin." For as long as you want it, the tear, the first he had seen, welled in her eye, but it was not one of sorrow. It was a tear of release, of arrival. She simply nodded, a universe of acceptance passing between them in that one, simple gesture. Time, which had once been Jacob's enemy, a relentless measure of his loss, now became a gentle friend. The seasons turned, washing the land with sun and the occasional, life-giving rain. The fierce heat of summer mellowed into the golden light of autumn, and the garden, which had once been a symbol of hopeless toil, was now a riot of color and life. It was a vibrant, impossible oasis in the middle of the harsh, brown landscape, filled with strange, beautiful flowers Jacob had never seen and rows of vegetables that now graced their table. The garden was a testament to My Lin's spirit, a physical manifestation of her ability to cultivate life and beauty in the most barren of places. The Vance ranch was no longer a monument to grief. The oppressive silence had been replaced by the rhythm of a family. The mornings were filled with the smell of cooking and the sound of the children getting ready for their lessons, which my Lin now patiently administered. The afternoons were spent working side by side, Jacob mending the corral while my Lin and the children worked in the garden, their quiet chatter and occasional laughter drifting on the breeze. His heart, the room he had locked and barred for so long, had slowly, almost imperceptibly, opened. He found himself smiling at Lily's stories, feeling a surge of pride at Samuel's growing confidence. He would watch my Lin as she moved through her day, her quiet grace a constant, calming presence, and he felt a sense of peace that he thought had been buried with his wife. One late afternoon, he was helping her stake up some heavy-headed sunflowers whose faces tracked the slow descent of the sun. Their hands brushed as they worked, a simple, accidental contact, but it sent a jolt of warmth through him. He looked at her, and she looked back, her eyes holding the same quiet understanding that had passed between them after the fight with Cane Thorn. No grand declarations were needed. Their love story was not one of fiery passion, but of a slow, steady growth, like the seed she had planted in the hard-packed earth. It was a love built on shared silence, mutual respect, and the quiet mending of broken things. Standing there, amidst the improbable blooms of their shared life, surrounded by the laughter of his healed children, Jacob Vance finally understood. A cruel joke had brought this woman to his door, but it was grace that had allowed her to stay. She had not just built a garden, she had shown him that his own shattered world could be replanted, and that hope, tended with patience and care, could bloom in the most desolate of hearts.